Good evening to our podcast. It's Christian Damm from the University of Frankfurt am Main, Goethe-Universität.
And
And
Jenny Münch from the University of Twente, Enschede.
yes, it's our second time recording the podcast about Rosa Luxemburg. It's still interesting, it's still nice. We are both Erasmus students at the Universidad Pablo de Olavide in Sevilla in the winter semester 2022. Currently, we are taking the course Sociología 1 from María José del Pino Espejo. Today, we want to present the famous German political theorist and socialist and communist Rosa Luxemburg. We are going to refer mainly to her 1899 published writing Social Reform or Revolution. We also have an example which is published by Free Arrows Press, New York. I will start to introduce you the person Rosa Luxemburg. Afterwards, Lenny will start to deep into the first chapters, the opportunistic method and the adaptation of capitalism. Later, I'm going to present you her chapter, Economic Development and Socialism. We try to give you quotes and we are trying to discuss. And yeah, so we're going to deep into the life of Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg is interesting, and we chose her because she is a democratic and anti-authoritarian socialist. She was the students' movement in the 1960s referred to Rosa Luxemburg. She was respected and recommended by opposing figures such as Hannah Arendt or Lenin, the big revolutionary from the Soviet Union. Anyways, she's opposing Lenin, and she was opposing Stalin in her time because they were authoritarian and they didn't had the same democratic values as Rosa Luxemburg had. Luxemburg was active in the German left movement for about 20 years, but she also speaks Polish and Russian fluently. Luxemburg's theory contributed to the German left, the theory of political dialectics, and the strategy of revolutionary political realism, in German Revolutionäre Realpolitik. They helped the left time and again to work through contradictions productively. Rosa Luxemburg was born in March 1871, when the German Kaiserreich was founded the same year. She grew up in Warszawa. I don't know how to pronounce it in English.
Warsaw.
From 1873. As I told you, German and Polish are her mother tongues. Russian she learned fluently in school. At the age of 16, she began to be involved in Marxist groups, and in order to avoid her arrestment, she fled to Switzerland in 1888, where she took up studies. She met well-known Marxist Russian theoreticians like Leo Yoriches, who became her husband. In her book, which Reformer Revolution, she is opposing, or she's discussing, Eduard Bernstein's book, which we are going to talk about. He was a social reformer from the German SPD, the Social Democrats, and they discussed about the politics of socialism and how a movement should reach socialism. Rosa Luxemburg was a rhetorically gifted speaker. She was very successful and a crowd puller. When she spoke, most of the times 10 more people came to listen to her. She also wrote the books Accumulation of Capital and Introduction to National Economics, which were both contributions to scientifically socialism. On the 10th November 1918, she returned to Berlin from Poland and became involved with the Spartakusbund and the Journal of Rote Fahne. Rätedemokratie, council democracy, and socialist goals, and she was a member, or she fought for council democracy, I want to say, and she supported the founding of the Communist Party. You could say that Luxemburg undoubtedly gave much of her life to the goal of overcoming wage labor and the rule of the law of value, and advocated the revolutionary Marxism, which she helped to develop in the future and further. She knew that she sacrificed law of children, family for a political struggle. So she dedicated her life to socialism, actually. And in her book, which we're going to talk about now, she is arguing for a revolution, for the capitalist society to overcome. Luxemburg argues that socialism is objectively needed to free the people. It is not a utopia, such as Bernstein argues. Furthermore, capitalism cannot be socialized, because there will always be classes. The revolution is needed because capitalism, as an organization of economy, cannot be just. It is not about making people poor people rich, but about changing the way of producing, she thinks. In her text, as we said, she mainly refers to Eduard Bernstein. He was part of the German Social Democrats and proposed that socialism should be introduced through social reforms. He wrote a book which is called The Precondition of Socialism and the Tasks of Social Democracy. This book is the basis of Luxemburg's Reformer Revolution. They are actually arguing only in this book. We can see that she will both argue that reforms are needed on the way to revolution, and reforms are needed and revolution are needed to change society. We're going to see. Lenny is going to start and introduce you the first two chapters.
Yes, the first chapter is called The Opportunist Method. Luxemburg starts off by explaining Bernstein's view. He says that the collapse of capitalism becomes less and less likely because capitalism itself becomes more adaptable and production becomes more differentiated. His reasons for that are that he thinks that crises are disappearing, that the middle class is becoming more resistant, and that there's a large section of the proletariat that is on the rise economically. He therefore wants to achieve socialism by expanding control and reforms, and also thinks that his explanations go hand in hand with the theory of Marx and Engels. In fact, there are contradictions, which Luxemburg points out. For example, he does not question the speed of the development, but rather the development and transition from the capitalist to the socialist system itself. The socialist doctrine is that a crisis is a starting point for the upheaval and the destruction of capitalism. The basic idea is that the contradictions of capitalism lead to crises and the end of the system. The results of capitalism, like growing economic anarchy, progressive socialization of the production process, and also the growing consciousness of the class of the proletariat, is a reason for that.
I want to contribute something, because Luxemburg argues with Bernstein that Bernstein is thinking that proletarians themselves cannot understand their position in society, but she thinks, and I'm going to quote on page 5 in the book, that the entire strength of the modern labor movement rests on theoretic knowledge. So Luxemburg wants to make knowledge accessible for the workers and for the proletarians. And Bernstein, the other side of the party, thought that politicians should act in the interests of the workers, which they for sure not did in the
No,
SPD.
that's true. And he denied also that capitalism produces these effects that inevitably lead to revolution or to the downfall of the system, and raises the question how socialism is achieved, even though it's clearly laid out in socialist literature and science, like how the steps are towards socialism. By raising this question, he kind of denies the objective necessity of socialism in Luxemburg's eyes. And he says instead that capitalism developed adjustment measures like cartels, credit, a means of transport, elevation of the working class. He says that all of those are means of adjustment, which partially resolve the contradictions of capitalism and therefore prevent the downfall of the system from happening. And also consequently saying that socialism is not necessary anymore if the contradictions are partially resolved. He sees the beginnings of socialism in the capitalist system and therefore declares the necessity for the transition to socialism too obsolete. If the means of adaptation are really able to make capitalism viable, socialism is no longer historically necessary, according to Luxemburg. So she says that either the revisionism and the reformism of the conservative side of the Social Democratic Party is right and socialism becomes a utopia, or the socialist side is right and the means of adjustments are just not true. Yeah, that concludes her first chapter. In the second chapter, she analyzes what Bernstein means with means of adaptation.
The adaptation of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. And according to Bernstein, capitalism can adapt through credit, for example, entrepreneurial associations, means of transport, organization of entrepreneurs. Yeah. First of all, there's credit, which has the function in capitalism to increase the expandability of production and also facilitate the exchange. And there, where capitalist production meets the barriers of private property, credit helps by merging many private capitals into one, so-called joint stock companies. This accelerates the cycle of production processes. Since crises are triggered by overproduction, that's because capitalism has an expensive tendency, or capitalist production, while at the same time our physical world has a limited possibility of expansion. So this is why it ultimately always comes to overproduction in capitalist systems. So since crises are triggered by that overproduction and the limited consumption capacity, credit is actually a perfect crisis catalyst. It also provides for production beyond the limits of the market. On the other hand, in the crisis, when a crisis is actually happening, the credit shrinks and is no longer fulfilling its function to be exchange promoting. So both in the crisis as well as leading up to the crisis, the credit is not an adaptation measure, but accelerator for destruction.
We can, if I could, I just found a quote which is explaining credit. Maybe I'm just going to read. On page 12, she explains credit by saying, we see that credit, instead of being an instrument for the suppression or the attenuation of crisis, is on the contrary a particularly mighty instrument for the formation of crisis. It cannot be anything else. Credit eliminates the remaining rigidity of capitalist relationships. It introduces everywhere the greatest elasticity possible. It renders all capitalist forces extensible, relative, and mutually sensitive to the highest degree. Doing this, it facilitates and aggravates crises, which are nothing more or less than the periodic collisions of the contradictory forces of capitalist economy.
Yes,
It's actually
that's
a nice quote.
Yeah, as you said, like credit is a powerful factor of crisis formation, which led her to say that this is what you just read, that this the factual function of credit is actually to banish the rest of stability that capitalist relation still has, bring the greatest elasticity possible, making it ultimately very sensitive to crisis. So in fact, it increases the contradictions between the mode of production and the mode of exchange instead of decreasing it. So that's another point or another way to prove that Bernstein was in fact kind of wrong in his analysis. It tightens production strongly while exchange is being paralyzed because of any minor inconvenience. Credit increases the contradiction between the modes of production and appropriation as well by separating production from ownership. It creates interest on capital. Credit also increases the contradiction between property and production relations by expropriating many small capitalists and creating immense forces of production and resources, monetary resources or wealth, in a few hands. Credit also reproduces like basically all capitalist contradictions. The means of the credit is a mean of destruction rather than a mean of adaptation, with a very high revolutionary effect. The next adaptive measure that Luxemburg tries to disprove is entrepreneurial associations, or entrepreneurial associations. Yeah, and that Bernstein says that they would regulate production and therefore reduce the anarchy of the market and prevent crises. Their purpose and effect is to act on the distribution of the mass of profit obtained on the commodity market by excluding the competition within an industry in such a way as to increase the share of that industry in it. Actually, they work against the elimination of industrial anarchy, according to Luxemburg, because the profit is mostly made from cheaper sales and production abroad, therefore causing competition and anarchy on the world market. Cartels are used to stop the fall of the profit rate in industries by burning a part of the accumulated capital. Abroad, the sales market is not an infinite process, though, and the world market is exhausted at some point. In itself, cartels are therefore also increasing market anarchy. Also here there are increased contradictions, especially between capital and labor. In that case, even to the extreme, because labor is seeing itself confronted with an overpowering organized capital. In addition, tariff wars occur, and there's a highly concentrated effect on the concentration of the production. Instead of means of adjustment, cartels and trusts are means to increase anarchy, contradictions, and accelerate downfall of the economic system of capitalism. Then Luxemburg continues to point out that Bernstein's own statements are also refuted by facts when you look at the crisis and political situations during that time. Because in the early 19th century, all the economical crisis happened because of a sudden expansion of the territory of the capitalist economy and not because of the narrowing of its scope. And also the fact that there were economic crises before and after Bernstein saying that capitalism is so well adapted that there are no crises anymore is also proving him wrong. Marx's theory of crisis was not wrong, in fact, as Bernstein claimed, because the cycle in which crises happen is irrelevant. Bernstein pointed out that it was not always the same period of time, but Luxemburg pointed out that it is not the time period that is important, but the fact that they are happening at all in a relatively relative rhythm. Yeah, she goes on to say that the productive forces will not be weakened because of the ongoing technical innovation, and at the same time the world market is not infinite, as mentioned before, so there can be no adjustment of production to exchange. Bernstein thinks further that medium-sized enterprises would counteract the destruction of the system. However, medium-sized enterprises will not disappear. They're like on a depressing trend, like decreasing. They increase the level of production, which leads to the fact that the medium-sized enterprises cannot keep up with the big capital and are thrown out of competition. But this is not a fight that happens once and for all and is over once and for all, but an up and down. They disappear a little and will return, and this is also because new spheres are opened from time to time. So, of course, in a one-on-one battle, the medium-sized enterprises lose, but again, they do not disappear. What effect it does have, though, is that the necessary minimum of capital becomes higher, and there's a shorter period of time that individual small capital survives. Yeah, also a more rapid change of the production methods. So small capital is actually the champion of technical progress, and small capital is vital for capitalism. So opposed to Bernstein's view, where he thinks that if small capital goes down, capitalism will have proven itself to be able to adapt to everything. It is instead the opposite. So it means that if small capital goes down, capitalism will also go down with it because it's vital for the system. In this whole chapter, Luxemburg showed how the adjustment measures described by Bernstein are, in fact, not only not adjustment measures, but they are active contributors to the destruction of capitalism. Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah, it gets really visible here how she can analyze his book and contradict him just by using socialist and Marxist thought.
Yes. Lenny explained to you the first two chapters. The two chapters were followed by the chapter Realization of Socialism Through Social Reforms, Capitalism and the State, and the Consequences of Social Reformism and General Nature of Reformism. I'm going to present you the chapter afterwards, namely Economic Development and Socialism. But first, I wanted to quote again, or I'm going to refer to the chapter Capitalism and the State, because I think it's interesting that Rosa Luxemburg pointed out that capitalism also nowadays wouldn't live anymore if the state hadn't intervened. On page 26, she's writing, the state became capitalist with the political victory of bourgeoisie. Capitalist development modifies essentially the nature of the state, widening its sphere of action, constantly imposing on it new functions, especially those affecting economic life, making more and more necessary its intervention and control in society. It's just a random quote, but she's writing about the role of the state in terms of rescuing capitalism from dying. But I'm going to deep into the chapter 6, Economic Development and Socialism. And I'm going to quote again. The greatest conquest of the developing proletarian movement has been the discovery of grounds of support for the realization of socialism in the economic conditions of capitalist society. As a result of this discovery, socialism was changed from an ideal, dreamt by humanity for thousands of years, to a thing of historic necessity, But Bernstein denies the existence of the economic conditions for socialism in the society of today. So Luxemburg um, tries to prove that socialism is a necessity, a historical necessity that arises from the exaggeration of capitalist contradictions in industrialized societies. Um, Further in the chapter, Luxemburg accuses Bernstein of being uninformed, of being of not having read Marx, for example. But she's saying that the number of shareholders is always increasing, which means that the capitalist classes are always increasing due to the phenomenon of shares. So the class of shareholders is not stable, but it's rising, and it's at some point it's going to lead in a, what did she say, a revolutionary destruction of the capitalist system. Furthermore, she says that the economic notion of the capitalist is no longer the single individual, but is nowadays a collective person, which is consisting of hundreds, even thousands of people. I'm going to quote again on page 41. Consequently, the economic notion of capitalist no longer signifies an isolated individual. The industrial capitalist of today is a collective person, composed of hundreds and even of thousands of individuals. The category capitalist has itself become a social category. It has become socialized within the framework of capitalist society. She opposes Bernstein of individualizing capitalism, but it's not a capitalism is it's not a decision of one, mainly not a decision of you and me, but it's a way of producing. Um, it's a way of organizing economy in a society in a brighter way.
He also doesn't view capitalists or people, entrepreneurs or something, as part of a collective class, but rather as individuals, which also does not go along with the Marxist way of thought. So this is another point where he is just not using the tools in the correct way and coming to conclusions that are not in line with the scientific methods.
Yeah, this is she's also referring to what you said. Also on page 41, we're saying to him, Bernstein, capitalist is not an economic unit, but a fiscal unit. And capital is for him not a factor of production, but simply a certain quantity of money. So he doesn't understand that it doesn't change anything if you make the poor rich, but there will always be classes, as scientifically socialism wanted to prove. Um, Further, she is actually going deep into Marxist theory, and she tries to explain the mechanism of commodity economy, which increases capitalist anarchy until it collapses. She is trying to explain the Marxist abstraction of the law of labor value, and um, 1 second. The law of labor which is existing in commodity economy. I want to explain the law of labor, law of value to you, but first I'm going to quote Luxemburg again, on page 45. Bernstein has lost all comprehension of Marx's law of value. Anybody with a small understanding of Marxian economies can see that without the law of value, Marx's doctrine is incomprehensible. Or to speak more concretely, for him who does not understand the nature of the commodity and its exchange, the entire economy of capitalism, with all its concatenations, must of necessity remain an enigma. And further on page 45, the secret of Marx's theory of value, of his analysis of the problem of money, of his theory of capital, of the theory of the rate of profit, and consequently of the entire existing economic system, is found in the transitory character of capitalist economy, the inevitability yes, thank you, of its collapse leading, and this is only another aspect of the same phenomenon, to socialism. It is only because Marx looked at capitalism from the socialist's viewpoint, that is, from the historic viewpoint, that he was enabled to decipher the hieroglyphs of capitalist economy. I'm going to quote, ending of the quote. I'm trying to explain the law of value. Marx's law of value states that producers in a capitalist economy work privately but are dependent on each other through the division of labor and the exchange of goods. This law acts as a kind of natural law. Market prices often deviate from their expected value because the law of value has a kind of natural growth. Production prices determine the value of the commodity labor power to all other commodities. So abstract human labor, according to Marx, is money. Marx's theory of value explains the necessary collapse of the capitalist economy, which we saw, I think, in the quote. So socialism is, as a scientific approach, had to be made the starting point of scientifically analysis of bourgeois society. This is how Marx was able to justify socialism scientifically. I'm trying to end the chapter by Luxemburg is trying to end the chapter by opposing Bernstein again and his strategies of aiming socialism by, for example, the cooperative principle or by trade unions, which are okay but are not abolishing capitalism. On page 46, she is quoting her last sentences are, Bernstein does not see in the economic structure of capitalism the development that leads to socialism. But in order to conserve his socialist program, at least in form, he is obliged to take refuge in an idealistic construction placed outside of all economic development. He is obliged, how do you say it? Obliged to transform socialism itself from a definite historic phase of social development into abstract principle. That is why the cooperative principle, the meager decantation of socialism by which Bernstein wishes to garnish capitalist economy, appears as a concession made not to the socialist future of society, but to Bernstein's own socialist past. So this you can really feel the harsh and tough language Luxemburg uses to oppose Bernstein.
I also think that maybe because during the time the party was separating, it makes you think what went on behind the scenes of them writing their books when they're already fighting that much about stuff in scientific literature.
Yeah.
How much must they have fought in person?
Yeah, for sure. Until nowadays, no? They still fight. Um, okay, I think what we talked about last time was, for example, or what Luxemburg also is talking about is maybe interesting nowadays about how capitalism leads into war and militarism. Um, those and she tries to prove that if you don't abolish the mechanism of capitalism by revoluting it, um, for example, creating or the production of arms is always a benefit for some people, and yeah, she tries to prove this in the book. And we're not going too deep further into the book, but um, she's writing about the conquest of political power. She's writing about how capitalism is going to collapse, um, and she's writing about the unions and about the how democracy and how the um, bourgeois democracy kind of is organized. Um, but we're not going to talk further.
It's definitely a very recommendable book. And I would say in my perception, she answered the question of the book with revolution and opposes Bernstein's view that, or like people in general, like revisionists, reformists, that any contradictions in capitalism can be solved by reforms.
But she's not against reforms though.
No.
She thinks that reforms can be used, that the proletarians can learn kind of revolution, and she thinks reforms are good in ways of if the government gives the workers spaces where they can meet, it's a good reform for
Yeah, that's what she thinks. But like she believes that reforms can never
only.
Go like beyond the contradictions of capitalism or like solve the contradictions between labor and capital or whatever. And Bernstein believes that on the other hand, and
she only thinks that they can serve the revolutionary movement. Yeah.
She still believes wholeheartedly that socialism stays and is a historical necessity, and that it needs to happen, and that it will happen, regardless of what social democrats say or want. And it's a very strong opinion what she's doing.
Yeah, she was radical. Yeah, we're going to. Do you have any last words? We're going to finish.
Yeah, I would say it was a great. It's a great read. It was a great second take. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Bye bye.